Hi, welcome back. I'm Terry Burns, and this is a continuation of my class on the Monas Hieroglyphica, or Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John D. We're up to Theorem 12. In fact, we've already had one video on it, so let me share my screen here, and we'll get started. Before we discuss some of the planetary shapes, here we're going to talk about time as alchemy and alchemy as revelation, great world ages, and how they connect to magic. We have already had videos, as you know, on the letter to Maximillian, the letter to the printer, and previous theorems, so this isn't the place to jump in. I'd love to have you take this course with me, though, so I've got a link to the whole playlist below, or just the playlist for the theorem, so I'd recommend that you watch the context. Anyway, I'm assuming you've watched them. You know who John D is, you know what the monad is, and you have watched the earlier videos. We're looking at how D has first created the universe via sacred geometry with different cosmogenic texts, and now he is seemingly on a rush to the end of time. So let's go back to Theorem 12 and see what's happening. He has told us the most ancient wise ones, the Magi, have passed down to us the hieroglyphic signs of the planets, all of which have been composed out of the characteristics for the moon and the sun. Now we know this is his moon sign, this crescent above, and this circle and dot is the sun. It's also the Pythagoreans, a symbol of the whole monad, and this whole thing is a stylized Mercury. But he's going to give us figures of the planets. Now, if you watch my cursor here, you know these symbols probably, and things like our modern symbol of Mars there don't look much like his symbol of Mars here. And he's going to have 4 symbols of Mercury, but here you can see one in the first column, another one in the 4th column, and then the whole stylized glyph of Mercury here. So we talked in the last video about he's treating the symbols for the planets as condensed sacred images. There's also a link below to a video on what he means by hieroglyph, but it's not an Egyptian hieroglyph. It's a sacred condensed image. And he's intuited or had revealed to him his true form, their true form, because he's doing this parallel action to what the Kabbalists have done with Hebrew and with different structures on the tree of life. That is, while Hebrew is the language of Mosaic law, perhaps it's deteriorated over time. So in the 2nd century AD or the 12th, depending on who's making the argument, you get the birth, as far as we know, of Kabbalism and trying to correct it just enough so that you can see the structure of how the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the subject of the Sefer Yetzirah, create the universe. Christian Kabbalists then go in and appropriate the work of rabbinic or Jewish Kabbalists and see the whole thing as prefiguring the second coming of Christ. Now, there's a Messianic Judaism also. There's a lot of looking for the second coming or the first coming of the Messiah in this time period. But Christian Kabbalists will take, for example, the Tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, and put in a sheen, so it's Yod He Shin Vav He, and get the Pentagrammaton, and then see, say, Adam presaging Christ, or what Adam represents Kabbalistically, presaging or being there and being overlapped by what a sacrificed God in some sense, or simply Jesus in another, will represent associated with Tiferet. So D is doing the same kind of thing with planetary symbols that Kabbalists have done with Hebrew. And after all, within the Kabbalah, there are planetary and zodiacal associations. Notice here also that he has all these Mercuries, and the Greek name of Mercury is Hermes. This is a Hermetic text, and remember the emerald tablet, the sun and moon creating the one thing, or monad. We also have all 4 elements here. We have Saturn, which you refer to earth, Jupiter to fire, Mercury to air, moon to water. We don't actually see the moon here, except all of these are made out of the moon, and later in the theorem you'll get the moon symbol itself. Right there, as a matter of fact. You see where my cursor is circling it. So he's going to use the language of physical alchemy, not only in the emerald tablet, but in almost every alchemical text, really. You get the marriage of the sun and moon, gold and silver, being the chemical wedding. And I've talked about the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, where D's Monas Hieroglyphica symbol appears. That's one of many reasons why Francis Yates considers the philosophy embodied by the hieroglyphic monad to be the hidden philosophy of Rosicrucianism. But it's not only in the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz. I mean, there's others going back a couple hundred years before D, 100 years before. You have like the Aurora Consurgens, and there's many, many others. So the chemical wedding of sun and moon is a mainstay of physical alchemy. And you can use the same language in talking about transformation of the soul or spiritual alchemy. Now, transformation of the soul is what you are doing as a Neoplatonist if you are trying to restore the Platonic concept of the good, just by the way. D is going to, and we'll see it in a minute here, he's going to discuss 4 revolutions, and it seems he's discussing 4 great ages and applying it to applying alchemy to time, that you're working through these revolutions to restore a golden age. You do remember there's a 5th element, right? Ether associated with the dodecahedron. We might want to think, where is the 5th element? Also, remember that spatial measurements in the Timaeus get associated with time after their image is captured by the receptacle and you go into the world of being in constant motion where you can never step into the same river twice. So take a tetrahedron where you have D's, ternary and quaternary, 4 triangles, in other words. Okay, it's perfect, but you can't even see it in the world of becoming, right? Now, if you look at all the numbers associated with the Platonic solids, you don't find a 7. That's why 7 gets associated with magical flux in time, as we've discussed with Theorem 7. But what you will see are lots of 12s, or things that could be divided into 12. But if we just take 12, all right, here we have 3 times 4. But down here we have 12 edges, then 12 edges, up here 12 points, up here 12 faces. Also, there are other things that we might associate with long world ages that we would see in the spatial measurements of the Platonic solids. Take 720 degrees total with a tetrahedron. Drop the 0 off, as we've seen D do from the letter to Maximillian on. So you have 720, and we've talked about that as not only related to the Shemhem Foresh, but related to the number of years, 72, that it will take a star, take the North Star, to go 1 degree. So we know the astrology of long world ages is simple math. It's going to be 360 degrees times 72. That's how far it's going to take this star right above me to go all the way around so that it's visible again from the same point on Earth. It's also a big problem if you're a Christian who's interested in literal biblical interpretation. And that is what D is dancing around in this whole theorem. And I think he solves it brilliantly. So apocalypse, D is an apocalyptic thinker. Now, D is also an expert in ancient Greek. So he knows that apocalypsis in ancient Greek means unveiling what is hidden. It doesn't mean the world comes to an end, although, you know, maybe D thinks the world is about to come to an end. I don't know. But eschatology, which is it's the branch of theology that deals with what happens after you die, but also what happens after the world ends. That whole field of theology would seem diametrically opposed to the idea of Platonic years if there are going to be humans on the planet that whole time, for the very simple reason that if you started Aries of Aries and you measure to us now, we're not even through 1 age. We've still got over 23,000 years to go. And there generally is not the idea that the apocalypse is coming, but like not for 23,000 more years. So you see the problem. This is the problem he's trying to work around. So we're going to look at Neoplatonic Christian fixation upon ages that focus on 7. And partly that's because it's the number of classical planets, but there are other reasons. And the biggest reason is to get out of this bind of, gee, we know what a great Platonic world age would be, but we shouldn't have that, right? Because the world's going to end. So I've also talked about last time how D, of course, would know, had known since he was a boy, given his study of Latin and Greek texts and the number of them in his library, that both in ancient Greek and Roman culture, you start with the golden age, and you can compare that to if you're a Neoplatonist, to the Garden of Eden. I mean, so I talked about Hesiod's epic works and days. Over here, you see one of the muses whispering into Hesiod's ear, because this is a revelatory text direct from the muse. And so the muse tells Hesiod that Kronos, the Titan, who is associated with the Roman Saturn, forms mortals, just like in the Bible, God forms mortals. Okay, but the mortals live like gods. They have wonderful lives. They don't work. They don't suffer. They're happy. They live in this endless spring. They even age backwards. But then Zeus, who is the Roman Jupiter, comes along and upsets everything. He overcomes the Titans. He takes control of the earth, and the Golden Age ends. The Silver Age begins. You get the most famous Roman telling of great world ages is Ovid's Metamorphosis. And while Hesiod has 5 ages, Ovid has 4, but the 4 that Ovid has are 4 of the 5 Hesiod has. It is, you go from a golden age to a silver age to a bronze age to an iron age. Hesiod has a age of heroes thrown in there too, if you want to go investigate that. So D has 4 revolutions. Is that an age? Well, seems like it. I also mentioned that there are some problems. Saturn, as being associated with the Golden Age on one hand, and alchemically with lead, is a problem. Not only that, there is no age of lead. So we're not going to be able to equate these 4 Roman ages with these revolutions. But if you think that part of his project here is restoring the golden age, then what you are going to have is something cyclical, right? You started with a golden age, and there's been a fall, and everything is sort of devolved, and suddenly we're going to restore the golden age. That implies the cyclical nature of time, and in fact, you have that in the Timaeus. Now, do you have it in the Bible? Hold that thought. We're gonna get to that, and we will get to that with the book of Revelation. But let's look at that in the Timaeus. Here's some eye candy for you. The Timaeus in ancient Greek wasn't an illustrated text, but this is a medieval manuscript where someone has tried to draw out what's going on with these sun and moon and planets. So here you have the sun, here you have the moon, Luna, down here the earth. Just some drawings of a medieval monk trying to help people understand what's going on here. Now, what happens when ideas of a great year meet Renaissance Hermeticism? You have Hermetic astrology. Hermetic astrology tends to concern itself with the astrology of long world ages and the precession of different planets through the zodiac and how it might be used to predict things. So you do that by observing the position of the sun's plane, the ecliptic on the equinox, so Aries of Aries. Remember, we had a theorem on the equinox here, and note where the ecliptic plane intersects the plane of the celestial equator. You can find wonderful animations of that online if you want. Each year that moves slightly westward. In fact, it'll move 1 degree every 72 years, and it takes about 25,920 years to return to the same location. One whole rotation is usually called a Platonic great year or one perfect year, and this is referring to a particular passage in Plato's Timaeus. If you did your homework and you read over the Timaeus, you know that it's talking about how the world soul is, when it's created, this eternal world is animated, and it's made of 4 elements with a 5th that's hidden. Then the creator forms this living cosmos. Is a perfect body. Your body, or a human body, is a microcosm of that macrocosm. Then you get this mixture compound divided up into a lot of different ways. The parts are bent into circles. The circles start spinning, or they imply spheres because they're always rotating. Note D is talking about revolutions. And since they are composed by this wise craftsman, this perfect creator, the harmonic intervals of the revolving circles or spheres become the moving image of the face of God. It's a beautiful visualization. In section 38, we're told that the sun, moon, and 5 other wandering stars, those are the planets, that they were made to preserve the numbers of time. Plato is not, or Timaeus in Plato, isn't the only ancient thinker that talks about this. One study of looking at ancient or classical world cycles in Greek, Latin, and Arabic sources gives a whole catalog of writers that look at it. It includes not just Plato, not just Aristotle, not just Pythagoreans, whether they're Platonic Pythagoreans or not, but also Lucretius, Cicero, Varro, Seneca, Tacitus, Plutarch, Vitruvius, Ptolemy, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Macrobius. And when you get to the end of this list, you're into the Christian era. So people have run into this problem already. And in the Renaissance, as we're going to talk about more later, rather than dividing things up into the age of whatever, like we do now, like age of Aquarius being about to start, or the Christian age being the age of Pisces, they will go into 4 great ages occasionally, but usually they divide it into 7. In case you don't know, the way that a regular year, a small year goes, is the opposite seeming direction as a processional or Platonic or perfect great year. So if it's the equinox and we're at Aries, Aries of Aries, then the next sign would be Taurus, followed by Gemini, followed by Cancer, then Leo, Virgo, etc. But if you're in the age of Aries, if you're at Aries of Aries, you're immediately going to go back into the preceding sign. So you have the age of Pisces, often symbolized by a fish. Some people have said that's why you get a fish with Christianity. That's partially true. And then you you'd go age of Aries, age of Pisces, age of Aquarius that way. All right, I'll talk more about them dividing up ages into groups of 7 in a moment. Before I do that, I want to talk a little about the Middle Ages. This is going to be a moral tale, and the moral of it is simple. Don't give precise dates for the end of the world. We're still here. No one's ever been right about this. So in the Middle Ages, first, they're called the Middle Ages in the Renaissance because Renaissance humanists, being very Eurocentric, not knowing a lot of the world beyond Europe, are considering the Middle Ages that middle period between these wonderful classics they've rediscovered from Greece and Rome and where they are. That's where we get the term Middle Ages. So I want to talk for a moment about Joachim of Fiore, sometimes called the Nostradamus of the Middle Ages. There are references in this theorem like midday. I mean, that's directly language of Joachim of Fiore. Yes, there are copies of his works in Dee's library, but we also know if Dee is interested in a Christian thinker who's dealing with world ages, he's got to deal in some way with Joachim of Fiore, who is by far the most well-known. Joachim divides the world into 3 ages. He's a Trinitarian. He writes, among other things, 3 very long introductions to Revelation. I'll give you a list of some of these down below. He, like Dee, is going to use Alpha and Omega as symbols of the Trinity. Unlike Dee, he's not going to use the Hebrew alphabet. People have made studies of whether there's any way he could have known Kabbalah, and the answer is a resounding no, not only because he lives basically about the time most people think Kabbalah is being born, but it's just he happens to use similar numbers of Kabbalists. That's very convenient for Dee. Or maybe one thinks that's just cosmically because those numbers are so important. If you're a Pythagorean studying them, that might be what you'd think. Anyway, he writes 17 books. Most of them touch on his 3 world ages. He has followers. They're called Joachimists. He takes a numerological approach to world history. Numerological, not mathematical. So he likes 2s, 3s, 5s, 7s, and 12s. He isn't the only one that does this. If you Google Bible code or prophet code or 5s in the Bible or 12s in the Bible, that's a very common, though very unscientific way of looking at the Bible. One of the problems that I have with it is if you are using it in a Hermetic text, it's usually stripped of geometric correspondences. But for example, you would have the 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles. So D has talked about a ternary, and the Trinity can be one of his ternaries, quaternaries, so 4 Gospels can be one of them, although he's preferred to discuss it geometrically, as you know. We had a quinary, right? Refers to 5 of the hand, it always implies 10. His decades are like 10 commandments. You get 5 books of God's law, or the Torah, and the Torah means law. So that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Joachim, like D, is going to really like 5s and 7s. Think of the seal of Ammon with D, for example. Let's give some examples from the Bible that might make you think that the numbers are important numerologically rather than just as literal descriptions. Though Joachim is going to fall into the trap of literalism, as I'll show you in a minute. So in all 4 Gospels, you have this story of the feeding of the multitudes. You may remember it from Sunday school if you're from a Christian tradition. So there's 5 loaves in John, Mark, and Luke, and there's 2 fishes. 5 and 2 is 7, yeah. But if you're in Matthew, there's just 7 loaves and the fish. It might make one think that what is important is the 5s and 7s rather than an exact count of, is it 2 fish or the fish, or, and then even the number that they feed, 5,000, you can numerologically take off the zeros and call it another 5. Or I'll give you a second example, Exodus. There's this holy anointing oil that the ingredients are given by God. All of this is revelatory, not observed, right? His ingredients are given directly by God, and you use it to consecrate the furniture in the tabernacle. It's comprised of 5 parts, and because of this, in Abrahamic traditions, the number 5 is often associated with revelation or grace. Just a side editorial comment, it's associated with the pentagram also. Pentateuch, pentagram. So the whole idea of a pentagram, for example, being diabolical or something just maybe means someone hasn't studied the Bible. Anyway, you get the Bible divided into 7 major divisions. Okay, if you're watching this still and following along, I know you can register numbers fast, so see if you see a problem with what I'm about to say, because there's a big problem. Okay, the Bible is divided into 7 divisions. There's the law, that first part that's the Torah, then you get the prophets, and you get the Psalms, you get the Gospels and Acts, and you get general epistles, and you get epistles of Paul, then you get magic 7, the book of Revelation. Supposedly the total number of books originally, this isn't true, but this is what was taught, was 49, or 7 times 7. So this integrates 7 into the Word of God. Now, if I take off my telling you what liturgists say and put on my scholar's hat, I would say the problem with this is that these are divisions made by human beings. I have, and lots of biblical apocrypha was thrown out. So this seems to me like forcing numbers, but that's my editorial comment in looking at it. Joachim doesn't like to divide 12 into 6 and 6. He likes 5 and 7. So say 5 ancient churches versus the 7 churches of Asia Minor that you get referred to in the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, of course, you get 7 seals, 7 lots of other things. If you start looking for numbers in the book of Revelation, you can find many, many of the same significant numbers used in sacred geometry. In fact, pretty much it's a 1-to-1. Let me just give you an example here from a passage that we're going to see in a later theorem. This is a vision of St. John. He has a vision of an open door, and here's the trumpet-like voice saying, "Come in and I'll show you what must happen afterwards." So what does John see? 24 elders, and they're on, well, there's 24 thrones on which 24 elders sat, dressed in white garments and with gold crowns on their heads. 24, and that number is, some have argued, because of the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles, but 24 is going to be a special number to D, right? and because there's 24 theorems, 24 hours in a day. Anyway, from the throne come flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder. There's 7 flaming torches. There's 7 spirits of God. Then you get 4 creatures. One resembles a lion. The second is like a calf. The third has a face like a human being. The fourth looked like an eagle in flight. And each of the 4 living creatures has 6 wings. Oh, that's 4 times 6, another 24. They were covered with eyes inside and out. And this continues. Revelation is an incredibly visual, numerically heavy, symbolic text that people have enjoyed speculating about, I guess, since it was written. Okay, but the problem with, say, Joachim of Fiore and D and everyone else in the Renaissance who has read Joachim of Fiore know this, is he's a literalist. He uses a biblical symbolism to come up with a literal date when his 3rd age, the age of the Holy Spirit, is going to begin. He also doesn't question these human-made divisions of the Bible. And a final problem is that a lot of the books that were used to come up with these numbers, like the Book of Jubilees and some other biblical prophets, they become apocrypha by Joachim's time, meaning they're not canonical text anymore. They've been kind of tossed out. Here's some eye candy from Joachim. Here's his 3 ages, right? The 3 circles, but you see how they're kind of wave-like. So they look almost like they're 4, or if we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we can get 5 ages out of it. You also are getting an alpha and a stylized omega. Down here, you're getting 7 circles because he is going to have 7s within each of these ages. Here is his tetragrammaton. We're not yet to the Yod He Shin Vav He. That came later, right? That is a creation of Christian Kabbalists. So here he's just writing Yod He Vav He, only he's writing them in Roman letters. Here is one of his 7 dragons. I mean, he has beautiful figures. In fact, there's a whole book called The Figurae of Joachim of Fiore. So let's talk about the problem D is trying to avoid here. Joachim has a famous division of history. Like I've said, he's assigning each age. And so you have the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. So the age of the Father starts with Adam. It comes to fruition with Abraham. It's going to end with Christ. It's the Old Testament. Then you get the age of the Son, and he does this double spelling kind of thing, only he's doing it with pictures and inferences. So we're going to see his age of the Son later in the Monad. But it begins with King Uzziah of Judah. It comes to fruition with Zechariah, who's the father of John the Baptist. And Joachim thinks this age is about to end in his own time, and it's going to lead to the age of the Holy Spirit and a utopian world. Now, when Joachim lives, he wasn't living in a real happy time. So this utopian vision was very, very popular. It's like peace and love. It's like the golden age of the Greeks and Romans. And according to Joachim, this age of the Holy Spirit of peace and love, and it was started with Saint Benedict, he thinks it's soon to arrive in this age right here, 1260 AD. Oops, it doesn't. Despite it not ending, and he's dies before 1260 gets here, but there's still followers, even in the Puritan colonies of what became the United States. There were still followers of Joachim of Fiore. Anyway, it's worth asking why 1260, and the answer is so simple that it's infuriating, given how much he read. And I confess he was my least favorite person to read when I was studying Middle English literature. It's because of Revelations 12, 1 through 6. A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and she fled into the wilderness so that she can be nourished for 1260 days. That's why. I'm not kidding. And not only that, it's days here, and in 1260 AD is a count of years. So substituting years for days, or days for weeks, or weeks for years becomes a habit in biblical numerical criticism. So you can loosely trace it back to the book of Daniel, which I'll talk about briefly in a moment. But if you want to learn more about Joachim of Fiore, I'll put some links below. Apparently there's a movie on Joachim coming out this year, so you can catch that if you want. I'm going to go on to the Platonic Great Year Meeting Renaissance Hermeticism, because you get to the Renaissance and texts are being rediscovered. D is near the very end of the Northern Renaissance. In Italy, the Renaissance has been going on for 150 years, and there are all these texts being discovered. There are forms of long world ages in these texts. And so humanists are trying to mesh this with Christianity. And this bit I mentioned in Timaeus, that the sun, moon, and 5 other wandering stars were made to preserve the number of time. And not only that, that at some point these cycles of time will line up. Timaeus says he doesn't know when, but sometime they will. We've already associated in Theorem 7, linked to that below, sevens with magical flux and the measurement of time, that there's not a 7 in any of the regular Platonic solids, because it's connected to this idea of flux. We've associated all of that with the great tree, and we are going to need all of those associations to see what he's doing here with great world ages. Now, I mentioned before we went back to the Middle Ages, this idea that in the Renaissance, rather than dividing a great year into the age of some zodiacal sign, or into 4 ages like Ovid, they seem to like dividing it into 7 ages. Well, there's a reason for that. And the 7 ages may implicitly be part of 4 longer Hermetic ages. That's one of the last things I'll get back to. So Trithemius, in his Stenographia, divided time into 7 angelic ages. That's a system that you can use to calculate out then, based on his system, D would be living in the age of the moon, and it's going to be ruled by the Archangel Gabriel. The fact that we are looking at angelic or archangelic actually rulers for different ages suggests the integration of Christian Kabbalism into this study of long world ages, by the way. And those of you who are ceremonial magicians or scholars of ceremonial magic probably know the Arbitel of magic. It was out 11 years after Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica, so I'm not saying it's a source. But just to give an example, it divides time also into 7 ages. And you learn there that each age is 490 years. Each age corresponds to a particular planet. Each age is ruled by an Olympic spirit that is associated with the planet. Then you'll get that refined by a Dr. Rudd and his 9 keys. And so the copyist, who is probably Peter Smart, says every Olympic power rules 490 years. But Dr. Rudd's age count doesn't match the Arbitels. So if you're using the one that Dr. Rudd has, you're having the age ruled by the Olympic spirit of the sun go to 1410, and then you get the age of Venus starting. And Dee thinks he lives in the age of Venus. That will become very significant in his spirit diaries. Even before Edward Kelly comes, you see him writing Aniel there. Well, Aniel spelled differently and with an umlaut is associated with Venus. Also, there's an Aniel in the Book of Enoch, but that's another story. Anyway, why 7s? What is their deal with 7s? I didn't talk about this in Theorem 7 because it wasn't important yet, but it's important now. Along with like the 7 seals of Revelation and all the other 7s discussed, the frequent use of 49-year intervals, 7 times 7, in sacred Jewish historical texts, or 7-week subages, which gets really, well, which you also get in Joachim of Fiore. These are often based on Daniel's prophecy in Daniel 9 of 24 again through 27 of 70 weeks. It's one of the most important sections of messianic prophecy in the Old Testament. It's both used by some Messianic Jews, and then it's used by Christians to talk about when Jesus they think is coming back. So within this 1 week becomes 7 years. Gabriel in verse 24 says to Daniel, 77s are decreed for your people in your holy city. Commentators take the 77s as 70 weeks of years. In other words, that's 490 years. And these provide a kind of clock that gives an idea of when the Messiah is supposed to come. And part of my comment before about this being human-made is where this is even more common than in Daniel is in biblical apocrypha, like the Book of Jubilees, or other texts like the Melchizedek document, sorry, I mispronounced that, the Testament of Levi, Ethiopia, Enoch, the Pseudo-Moses text. Now, none of these are in Dee's library, but you know something? If he had copies or knew of them, they would not be in his diary because they would get him in a decent amount of trouble. So just in case you want to do the math here, 70 weeks, so that's 490 years. If you go to the Book of Jubilees, that's 10 Jubilees, so 1 Jubilee is 49 years. Or let's go back to our long count of a Platonic great year, since Dee and other astronomers know that the amount of time it takes for a star to precess 1 degree. So if you divide that by 490, 25,920 divided by 490, you get approximately 52, like 52 weeks in a year. In fact, one can speculate, along with just empiric observation of the calendar being off, that this is one reason Dee knew the calendar was off, because this is approximately 52. It's actually 52.8979, etc. So then you get approximately 52 490-year weeks in a great year. These kind of dating systems are almost always associated with either a Messiah or an apocalypse or both. Whether the writers are Hellenistic Jews like Josephus or Demetrius, or the Renaissance, or Isaac Newton did the same kind of thing. When Christians are doing it, they're usually trying to predict the second coming. Now, I've already talked about magical flux and associated all this with the great tree. So we can further assume that as a Kabbalist, Dee understands that the sun or Tiferet, or the sacrifice god of the ascension of consciousness, rather than the sun returning as a Messiah. Or at least, since we know that he's an expert in ancient Greeks and knows what the word apocalypse means, that this is one understanding he has, if he might also believe in Jesus as the second coming. But he understands this idea of ascending consciousness, restoring the bonitatis, healing the tree, and so on. So in this way, the gold of Tiferet, the purification of one's own personal energies, so one may bring the energy of the cosmos and literally make above like below, this is going to become one of the treasures of the working. Oh, treasures, that will eventually bring us to Yesod. Okay, folks, I'm back to Theorem 12, and now we're going to see what he means by these 4 revolutions. He has said it will not be difficult to explain each of these hieroglyphs from our previously established foundations, but first let us now discuss paraphrastically those that have the imprint of the moon, and thereafter those of the sun. The sun's going to be in Theorem 13. He is going to say, throughout the science of the elements, our lunar nature once revolved around the earth is mystically called Saturn. He has associated these with elements, and he seems to now think one rotation is going to make it an elementata, a primary substance. Saturn, Jupiter, the moon, and Mercury then become the primary substances associated with the 4 revolutions, if you want to do it that way. So the moon becomes Saturn. Throughout the science of the elements, our lunar nature, when once revolved around the earth, is mystically called Saturn. Well, this is our lunar nature. Our lunar nature would actually be referred to a sephra, right? To Yesod, which is the moon. It also reminds us of a few theorems back when the moon is looking up at the sun, when we flipped the monad. Saturn astrologically is sometimes thought of the higher octave of the moon, but more importantly, in terms of Kabbalah and in terms of D's correspondences in Theorem 10, Yesod is associated with the moon and the reflection of the sphere of Saturn, Bina. And it is sometimes referred to the path from Yesod to Malkuth. For instance, in The Art of Kabbalah, which we've also talked about before, that book by Reuchlin, or it can also be the moon acting through Saturn upon the four elements. So by conflating what D is doing here with Plato's Timaeus, you wind up with the third Sephira, Bina, as the receptacle in the Timaeus. So what you have in Kabbalah is, after the kind of Big Bang, Kether's, the energy of Kether goes to Hokmah, and Hokmah shoots out all of this energy to Bina, the third Sephira, which gives it form. That is the function in Kabbalistic thought of the Sephira Bina. And it creates the great tree through Dot, which we talked about in Theorem 11. So if you consider that what Bina is receiving from Hokmah is that world of being in the Timaeus, then it's basically the receptacle, because Bina is still, this is also why I haven't described any of the 2,000 years of scholarly argument about what the receptacle is, because I knew I was going to be telling you here, this is what D is portraying the receptacle as, the Sephira Bina. It takes images of the eternal world of being and shapes it into the world of becoming. That is going to mean his golden age is the 7 days of creation. That's a totally safe association. The 7 days of creation through the time when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, the fall. If you want to explore this more, take a look at the discussion of gold in the Timaeus, in the discussion of the receptacle. It's like there's no question that's what he is doing with Saturn, the moon, and Bina, and the golden age. All right. You can even, if you want to take it further, correlate it with Paracelsus. Remember, there's no one D has more copies of books in his library written by than by Paracelsus. And he's lending them out. He's apparently teaching Paracelsus stuff to people. Particularly, you could look at the Book of Vexation. It talks about 7 metals. There are some later works this one, the Aish Mezaref, is one that I'll look at with Jupiter probably. Now we had the first revolution is Saturn. For the same reason, it also had the name of Jupiter and retained a form apart. We have talked about how Jupiter can be associated with tin, mirrors are made of tin, and you get this upside down and flipped form of Saturn and becoming Jupiter, or vice versa. So is this going to be the Silver Age? Well, I guess we could think, well, tin looks kind of like silver, but people knew the difference between tin and silver. That's possible, but it's not that convincing. Paracelsus has some interesting things to say in that Book of Vexations about Jupiter. He says it has nothing of the quintessence, the stone of the philosophers, the great work. It has nothing of a quintessence in his composition, but it is of the nature of the 4 elements. Well, is that going to help us? Well, let's see. The sphere of Jupiter is the 4th one on the Kabbalistic tree. Bina was 3, right? Jupiter is 4. We've got ternary and quaternary again. It's just below the 3 supernals, Kether, Hokmah, Bina. The sphere of Saturn, Bina, is this contracting form in Kabbalistic thought within the prana materia, the Ein Sof Aur, which are limitless light. It also, in other texts, like the 8th Mizaref, is called universal Mercury. So, with a kind of twisting, whirling motion, does that remind you of anything like whirling ones, Ophanim? Jupiter, associated with the Sephira Kesed, bursts out of the invisible folds of creation. You can't see what's going on with Kether, Hokmah, and Bina. In fact, the highest you are supposed to be able to comprehend usually is Tifereth. But Kesed bursts out of the invisible forms of creation, and it becomes the day, bringing light into the visible world. The God name for Kesed in the four Sephira is El, the one God, not the Elohim, which is multiple gods. So you can correlate this with when time starts. D's second revolution starts. Aries of Aries. One of the most complete written versions you get of this comes after D's time. It's the Ace Mesereth, which I've talked about already. The original Hebrew text, if it ever existed, doesn't appear to survive, so we don't really know when the original one was written. According to Raphael Patai, who wrote a wonderful book called The Hebrew Kabbalists about Hebraic, he wrote the Hebrew Alchemist. I don't know what I just said, but I meant to say the Hebrew Alchemist. It's looking at Jewish alchemists. So he mentions this, and so does Gershom Shalom, who's a great scholar of within the tradition of Judaism. They both say that the Latin translation dates from about the 1500s or early 1600s. It was first published in Latin by Norban Rosenroth in the Kabbalah Denudata, and someone you may know, W. Wynne Westcott, translated it. I would assume, as do many others, that these associations are translated, when by the time they're translated, they're pretty well known. That's how this works. Think of what we found with the Kircher tree, for example. So now we're going to go on to the moon. And they designated the moon the third time a primary substance was brought forth. It's this line that lets us know that the first two, with Saturn and Jupiter, that they were also primary substances. So what D has done with the Timaeus is made the planets, 4 of them, primary substances or elementatus. So Kabbalistically, it's referred to Yesod, it's referred to the silver. So is this going to be the Silver Age? And what happened to Tiferet and the sun? Well, that's going to be Theorem 13. You can keep going with correlating this to Paracelsus if you want to. You can do the same thing with the Aish Mesereth. You'll find things like the moon or Luna in the history of natural things is called medicine for the white, because she hath received a whitening splendor from the sun, which by a like shining illuminates and converts to her own nature all the earth, that is the impure metals. And we have the work of the whitening here. All right. But notice what I have not done, and you perhaps are rather unsatisfied. I've told you what the golden age is, Saturn. I didn't give a name to this age of this Jupiter. It's a second revolution, nor to this third one. So let's review here. We've got 4 figures in these first 3 columns here, made of the moon. Yesod is referred to the moon. We have 4 Mercuries. There's one in the first column, one in the 4th column. There's another down here. It was also in the margins. And you have this one. You've also, if you consider these 2 the same, you've got this stylized one here. 4 Mercuries made of the sun and moon. So if we can be certain that the golden age is when the world is created, the 7 days of Genesis. The next age associated with Jupiter, Kesed, begins when time starts. It's Aries of Aries. And D knows very well, once time starts, if he's really talking about real world ages, he's got 26,000 years to go. But if you just call it a fallen age and you're trying to return to a golden age, you work back up the tree. So remember, this monad glyph was right side up. Then we flipped it with the lightning flash of fire down. Then it flipped back up again. And now we have Aries, or associated with fire, firing your spiritual progress back up the tree. So in the fallen age, you start a return to the golden age by working back up the tree of life, by individually or as a group healing the fallen world or the great tree. And that is an act of revelation, because you're going to be pondering these things, wanting direct communication. You can posit that as a fourth age or be guided by spirit to do it now and to complete the great work. That is the secret proposition here. So what if you want dates? There's an unprovable thesis that was offered by my late friend Vincent Bridges. He said that he looked at the Hermetic tradition and saw the great year cycle has 4 ages of roughly 6,000 years each, right? 6 times 4, 24,000 years. According to Timaeus and Joachim of Flores, these ages were composed of 7 archangelic periods organized in a threefold overlapping wave. You can work back through there and find ways to support that. I don't think doing so is going to help you understand the monad, and you won't find it written out anywhere because it's occulted. So you can take his word for that or not. So this begs the question, has all of this been a great sleight of hand on Dee's part because he knows apocalypsis means unveiling, not the end of the world, or because he thinks the end of the world is coming, but he doesn't know when? Well, actually, he's going to bring all these ideas back in the very next theorem. But don't read this as looking for countable world ages. Dee's return to the golden age or to an Edenic state will feature the book of Revelations, but not in any way you can easily measure from Malkuth. And it's going to take us to that passage I read about the 24 elders rotating around the throne of God. In the next theorem, he's going to work planetary signs made out of the sun symbol into his Kabbalistic processional astrology. So if you want some homework, no one ever does, but if you did, take a look at that next theorem and see if you can figure this out for yourself. Otherwise, I'll have another video out in about a week. Thanks a lot for hanging in there with me. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.